Welcome to Scream Therapy. I'm your host, Jason Schreurs. In October of 2018, I found myself in the hospital, sitting across from a psychiatrist who was telling me I had bipolar. I was sent home with a bunch of medication and laid on the couch for a week. I had my iTunes library on shuffle, trying to shake the hornet's nest from my head. Ever since I was a kid, I've been using loud music as a form of therapy. Punk rock and mental health have always been connected. This podcast looks at that connection through the lens of different guests. This is Scream Therapy. Well, the 5th year of the Scream Therapy podcast is blazing by. Welcome to episode 110.5, a recap of the past 10 episodes, with people who link their involvement in the punk scene with their mental health, and the mental health of others. With each of these conversations, I learn more and more about how to maintain stability while living with mental health conditions that I have to manage every day. Like the peer-led support groups I'm part of, talking to other punks about their experiences has been instrumental in my health. My hope is that you, the listener, will find inspiration and feel supported by the stories in these episodes. Episode 101 featured Tara Hahn of California ska punk band Half Past Two. Tara talked about advocating for people with disabilities within the punk scene. Tara also addressed the difficult emotions and subjects in her music, something she shied away from in previous years.
I've always just been sort of a glass half full, very positive person. And I want to have a sort of open book, angry Half Past Two album. So that was the challenge for me. And so sometimes I would come right from a therapy session and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I had to talk about this. Our song Talk Is Killing Me was about, I experienced some physical abuse as a child that I was talking about in therapy, and would you feel comfortable writing about that? And I wasn't, but I have also got a lot of meaningful feedback. Writing about my stalker, writing about stuff that went on with the band was really just a practice in music is cathartic.
On episode 102, I welcomed clinical social worker Eli Nowak of Break to Broken. Eli discussed the freedom and empowerment he felt after opening his own mental health practice. Using an eclectic approach, Eli encourages his clients to search for identity and individuality.
People show up connected to a variety of circumstances. I'll put it that way. It's not a one-size-fits-all deal. So everyone's looking for something, but they're not exactly sure what they're looking for a lot of the time. So I guess that's part of my job, is to try to help them find it. And I guess I can connect that to, the feeling I got with regard to punk rock. Again, being that introverted, shy, quieter kid, not exactly knowing that I wanted to feel something and connect in a certain way, but not really knowing exactly what that looked like until I found it. It's kind of where the magic happens, I suppose, in therapy.
Lifelong punk troubadour Cactus Vela guested on episode 103. Cactus chatted about his history in punk and dealing with personal struggles along the way. Whether it was anxiety, panic attacks, or substance misuse, Cactus leaned on the punk scene to help him cope and eventually stabilize.
It's interesting because anxiety itself becomes the most undeniable influence on me as a musician. Up until that point, if someone said, what are your influences? I'd be like, oh, well, definitely Leatherface. And I'd name all the artists that inspired me. I remember being in this recording studio and listening to my guitar track back, and the producer just being like, you have a way of playing guitar. He's like, there's something very subtle in there that I haven't heard before. And I'm like, what is it? And he's like, I don't know. And he looks at me. He's like, what do you think it is? And I'm like, anxiety? We all started laughing. And I remember walking away going, anxiety has now become the biggest influence on my guitar playing. If you listen to just my style, and I'm not sitting here saying oh, I'm great or nothing, because I'm not. But if you listen to my style, and if you hear some of the little nuances and things I'm doing, that's a product of anxiety. That's a product of a mind grappling with itself.
On episode 104, I talked to Chris Watts of Upset Boy and the Queens. Chris detailed this perfect storm of stress and mental health issues that resulted in a panic attack on stage. Upon reflection, Chris realized his unwellness was due in part to suppressing post-traumatic stress from an incident during Hurricane Katrina.
I didn't deal with it. I didn't want to deal with it. If anything, it was like the imposter syndrome thing. Yeah, I got shot, but it was just in the Superdome, and I'm just a National Guardsman. And minimalizing it and just trying to move on and forget about it. I just wanted it to be over with. I wanted to just move on and get it behind me as soon as possible. Probably not the healthiest way to go about coping with something like that, but it was the imposter syndrome. I was like, well, I don't have PTSD. That's for guys that go off to war, that go overseas, see action and see all this stuff. I'm just a dumb National Guardsman that got shot in the Superdome by accident.
Amanda Pants of the Meringues joined me on episode 105. Amanda explained how surviving a troubled youth helped her move forward with her mental health and her work in the education system. Amanda's friendship with her future bandmate in the Meringues was key to going back to school.
The program I was in, unfortunately, was a very lockdown program. Can't go in with any personal items. You can't leave. You are there from the start to finish. I had found out that Alabama Shakes was coming to Ottawa, and I basically begged my doctors, can I go? Like, please, I know it's not a thing where you let us out at nighttime, but please let me go to this thing. And they kind of said, okay, if you can do A, B, and C, and throughout this week, we will let you go to this show. And a band called July Talk, who's a band from Canada here in Toronto, they were opening up that show, and I had never really investigated them. So I started investigating them and was, well, these guys are kind of cool. You know, this is going to be a really great night if I get to go. And I messaged Ted and said, will you drive down to Ottawa? And he was like, absolutely. So got the okay, and we went out and to that show that night, and it was absolutely amazing. I think I bawled for the first half of the set of Alabama Shakes. But when July Talk opened the show, they blew my mind. I don't know if they were just super amped up that night, but they came out with just so much energy. And there were moments even I was like scared watching this band. I was like, oh my God, like what is happening? But it was just so energetic, and I loved every second of it. And when we left the show that night, I turned to Ted and I said, we need to start a band. There's something about that first band that I love. That was the catalyst to starting the Meringues.
Anna Troxel, lead screamer of Mugger, joined me on episode 106, opened up about her long struggle with anorexia and how it almost killed her. Anna explained what led her to seek help at her lowest point, and how she's been able to maintain her health and stability since then.
I was waiting for the subway in New York City. I was coming home from work, and someone just came up to me and said, I think you should go to this. A week or two before, someone had approached me in the subway and said to me, my sister died of anorexia, please get help. It was clear. It was clear to people what was happening. So having that happen right before someone handed me the support group flyer was just seemed like sort of these bookends of, okay, like something needs to change. And the facilitator there, she was also a therapist, and she approached me after a couple of meetings and said, I'd like to see you privately. And I said, I can't afford that. And she said, don't worry about that. And she saw me for a very, very low amount for a long time. And I learned, I wasn't alone. I didn't do this to myself. This isn't a mistake I made. So just kind of getting over that hump. And eventually, she's the one that got me into inpatient. I don't know if I'd be alive today if I hadn't found them, because I was on this steamroll path of destruction and I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to get off. It's not like it instantly changed, but that was what led me to getting well.
Episode 107 featured bleeding through screamer Brandon Shapati. Brandon recalled what his life was like when he was hiding his bipolar diagnosis from his bandmates. Brandon tried to pretend he was okay for years, but as his mental health deteriorated, everything came to a head, and he disclosed his condition to the band. They rallied behind him, and Bleeding Through thrives to this day.
Before, in the early days, it was more of I hid it. I hid it from my band, I hid it from the world. It was something that I battled alone with, which is kind of like the worst thing to do if you're bipolar, really. But I didn't really want to use it as a crutch for my band. When I was having bad days, I would just tell my band I was just having bad days. They didn't know what was really going on with me, and I just didn't really feel like sharing it. I almost tried to pretend it just wasn't really a big deal, and it wasn't really having a part in my life. I felt like I kind of almost like cured myself of it for so long, just dictating so much of your life. And I just felt like I'm not struggling with anything mental. I can kind of just overcome this just by a positive mindset and attitude. And it worked for a little bit, hiding and coping and being able to kind of isolate and hide. But then I felt like I was living a secret double life from my band.
New Jersey punk staple Sammy K, most recently of punk supergroup The Kilograms, joined me in episode 108. Sammy talked about the evolution of his mental health. Juggling several diagnoses, Sammy is currently navigating schizoaffective, which includes a number of voices in his head. Sammy has learned to be curious about the journey he's on and has found ways to manage his daily life.
In the last year, it's the first time that there's been auditory hallucinations where they've projected out. It's been all right and tame. I definitely have learned my triggers. I know when they're coming. Like, I can feel it. My partner and I try to squash it or do the thing as best we can while understanding that there's no way to stop them. When they come, and you ride the wave. There's about 7 characters in my mind that come and go. There's definitely a snap between the militant one and the let's go get ice cream, like the child in me. It's very much a light switch.
On episode 109, I welcomed Rocky Vadalato of Susalo. Rocky talked about how the death of his adult child in 2022 shook him to the core, and continues to shake him to the core along the path of grief recovery. Rocky told me that enveloping himself in loud sounds will be a huge part of the long road ahead.
When something like this happens, you're always wondering, oh my gosh, am I going to be like this forever? And one of the things my grief therapist told me early on was that you're never really going to get over this. It's not something that ever really just goes away. You're going to carry this the rest of your life. I think when you lose a child, it's in another category, essentially, than losing someone like your grandma or your mom. I mean, it's still grief, and all grief is valid in its own way. But most people say that this is kind of one of the hardest experiences you can have as a human and as a parent. The grief doesn't ever go away, but you do get better at carrying it. That's where the hope lies for me. That's important for me to share that with people, because I have felt a lot of resilience, a lot of gratitude for my community coming together to support me. And that's another thing my counselor said is it's a real litmus of whether people do recover or not, is if they have a community of support around them and how well they're able to accept help from that community. And I think there's beauty in that. But I think it's kind of like a container, and the grief at first is filling the entire container and your life just feels like you can't function. But eventually the container grows and you can still hold the grief along with your life better.
Romy Hoffman of punk new wave band Agender joined me on episode 110. We talked about her life as a sober musician. Romy explained that not using substances has allowed her to process and heal through her music.
Getting sober is really scary when you're an artist, because you don't know. It's like, oh, how am I going to write? How am I going to create? That's part of your identity. It's like, who am I if I'm not the wasted party animal, debaucherous, chaotic person? It took time to settle. And I did really start Agenda in response to that, getting sober and being all these feelings and thoughts for the first time in my life, having new thoughts and feelings and not know, it's great that I know, I can turn to art. Art's always the thing that's helped me through this stuff, and just do that, start a new project, get your mind off things. Punk rock is the best avenue for you to just go blah, 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 and just pass out what's really going on. With Agenda, the passing out of things and starting off with that chaotic, raw person. And then it has again, I've done so much work and processing the work I've done through this project, tackling it in songs and seeing how it has smoothed out and how I am who I am now, just a more refined, as complex for sure, but you can see that through the trajectory of the albums, who I am now as opposed to then.
I encourage you to go back and listen to these full episodes and many more at screentherapyhq.com. I recently guested on the Pete vs. Anxiety podcast. Thanks to Pete for having me on. Here is a short clip of my appearance, which can be found on the Pete vs. Anxiety YouTube channel.
Guys, welcome to another exciting episode of Pete vs. Anxiety, the mental health podcast breaking the stigma that mental health is talked about enough. My guest today is the author of the Scream Therapy, A Punk Journey Through Mental Health, and an internationally renowned host of the Scream Therapy podcast, the one, the only, Jason Schreurs. How you doing, buddy?
Good, Pete. How are you doing?
Good, man. Well, thank you for coming, man. I appreciate it. So, how did you get started on the whole Scream Therapy thing? I mean, it's so interesting to hear that you're combining music and mental health together, because I think a lot of people apply them together at first, because a lot of times you always have that music, that song. It always makes you feel better when you're in a down mood. So,
yeah, for sure. It's something that I kind of subscribed to my whole life, getting into punk rock when I was a kid and all through my teen years, my adult years, and using it as a place to feel welcome and that I belonged. And the music, like you said, it really hits you and helps you through hard times. It wasn't until I got really unwell and had a major mental health crisis that I actually got into the idea of combining the two for a podcast and a book. So coming home from the hospital after being diagnosed with bipolar and having a psychotic break, it was like, okay, well, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? Like I'm just completely beaten down. I'm starting from scratch. I had done a lot of things, previous to that, in music and writing. So it just seemed natural to get into it and put the two together as a way of my whole journey of, getting back on my feet.
Yeah, that's awesome though, man. I mean, first off, sorry to hear that you had to have a psychotic break before you get there. But I mean, at least you looked at it on the other side and said, hey, what am I going to do something instead of letting this thing own me and make me put a label on me saying just because I have bipolar doesn't mean, I have to be treated differently,
Yeah. And I feel like at first it did own me. And I think that happens with a lot of people, going through that and realizing that there's something going on like that. It does consume a person. It consumed me for a while. And it was the kind of a process of getting back on the way to being well. And a huge part of that was actually talking to people like you and other folks who are on my podcast and starting to write about the topic of mental health in my own life. That was a huge part of the process of, getting back to where I wanted to be.
Yeah, and it was so interesting too when I read punk rock. I'm like, man, dude, I like punk rock too, And I didn't get into it until high school, like we were saying right before I hit record here, and it was I still I love it. I listen to metal. I listen to everything now, but I listen to a lot of punk rock, like Anti-Flag, Black Flag, Poison Ivy, Operation Ivy, and all those kind of things. Like the Clash was a big one when I was younger because my mom was a big Ramones fan and stuff like that too. So we listened to that all the time. And, I had a little splash of everything as it started coming down. And then I started discovering it on my own a little more. I went deeper and checked out some of the other stuff. And I started to really like it, the fast pace and things like that. Those days when you're just like, you need to pick me up, you turn it on and just the guitar just starts going and you're just like, oh, you start feeling that amping up and going on everything too.
Yeah. And it's not vapid music. There's a message there too, which I think is, it's really important for music to have an effect on you. Mm-hmm. It has to also have a message to it. And punk rock's always been about, looking at authority figures and politics. And from what I found out kind of after doing a bunch of research, a lot of ties to mental health, right back to the Ramones and bands all through the decades of punk have always had a tie to writing songs about mental health and dealing with mental health conditions themselves.
That's so cool though, that, that you discovered all that as you go. And then you're realizing, hey, I have these things. So what am I going to do? So how did the book come to picture? Is it like a story of your life or is it basically like, hey, this is what I'm going to do now that I know I have this thing. I'm going to make something of it.
A bit of both. I mean, it's very much a memoir, what they call a memoir-plus. So it's my story of a time in my life. In this case, my relationship to my mental health. But also I talked to other punks in the book that have their own experiences, including a lot of mental health professionals that have had, upbringings in the punk scene. And so they're in there as well. And I sort of tie it together with myself and speaking to them and learning about them. So it's not at all like a self-help therapy book. It's more a creative nonfiction writing book. And it's got a lot going on with it, but I think it ties together really nicely. It's a quick read and it's got a forward momentum through the whole thing, which I think is good for that kind of a book.
Yeah, especially memoirs are great, though. I just finished reading, actually, this one right here. She'll be a guest here about 2 o'clock. It's called The Mansectomy I've Always Wanted by Erica Campbell. and it was talking about how she had breast cancer and things like that. And I've been interested now. There's I've been reading these memoirs. I'm like, man, now I'm gonna have to read yours too. I'm like, I saw it in your profile. I'm like, damn, now I gotta go get a copy of this thing and read it because I'm interested to see, how it goes. Because hers was interesting. The way she did it was like she told the story, of everything going on, and then she put these nice little poems in there too, of just things related to different.
Cool.
And it was kind of cool though that she added them in there. And the end of the book, holy crap! Like, talk about putting yourself out there. She had actual pictures after the operations and stuff on there, and for her to put that in a book and let people see that, I mean, that's powerful in its own. Like, that's putting yourself out there, full blank slate for people to see, and things like that. So,
yeah, I mean, there's two aspects to that. Number one is that writing is a form of healing. So, it's putting yourself out there as a way to have, kind of process things yourself and to have therapeutic value for yourself as you're writing it, but also to put it out there so other people can relate to it and hopefully, share experiences with what they see in the book. And so, it's interesting. It's for me, it was very much like, at first, it's very much like, I've got to write this thing. I can't move on in my life until I write this thing.
Yeah.
And then it got into more like, okay, so how do I tell this story in a way that's going to be compelling for people to read? And it ended up being, there's some interspersed parts about touring in a band. And sort of when I was on this tour with this band, it got really, really sketchy and hairy for me. And that led into some other problems. And so it's like, it's a way of really like expressing myself, but also saying like, look, this is what happened. And can you relate? Especially with the punk stuff, can you relate to being in the punk scene?
Eyewitness encounter, though, like you're telling the story through your eyes. Like, this is what's going on. This is what I'm dealing with currently, and I like those. And I'm liking memoirs a lot more. I'm starting to read more, and let me tell you, memoirs are starting to become my thing because I love being able to see through other people's eyes with things they're dealing with, and you could feel the emotion too, because the way this is your thought process going on, so people know what you're thinking as this stuff is going on. In that hairy situation coming up, you're just like, oh yeah, hey, something don't feel right about this. So, did the book lead into the idea of the podcast? Not to cut you off.
I think it was the other way around. Well, maybe not. It kind of came simultaneously. So what happens when I came home from the hospital? Again, I was beaten down. I was still in sort of the throes of a manic episode, and then I was crashing into depression because the way that bipolar works is like you go high and then you go low. That's the basic pattern of it. And so I kind of just wrote in a notebook because crashed out on the couch. Wrote a notebook that I'd like to do. I wrote down scream therapy just as a phrase that I'd used in my journalism, punk rock journalism through the years. I'd often use that phrase. And then I wrote down podcast and book. And I think the idea was to do them kind of at the same time, but I wasn't able to get back to writing because my brain was just really shook up by the psychotic episode. So what I did is I started doing the podcast first, just talking to people like you and, guests from punk bands and whatnot, having conversations like this, which I found to be easier than actually sitting down and planning to write a book. And then the book started about a year and a half so after the podcast.
That's awesome though, man. And when you start doing the podcast, you're reaching out to people, telling them this idea. How did they take the idea? Because sometimes it's like, you trying to get people on the show. Was it easier or was it hard to find people that would come on and talk to you? Because some people don't want to share certain things, and some people are kind of like, well, I've never been on a podcast, and they're always hesitant because they're like, well, I've never been on one. What is it like?
Yeah, I think it's a testament to how much we talk more about mental health and how it's perceived in the world. But I didn't have any trouble finding people. I didn't have any trouble with people saying they didn't want to talk about something or feeling, some people felt nervous, of course, but I wasn't getting a lot of roadblocks along the way. People were really happy to talk about their struggles and what they went through. And so that was really encouraging and validating to know that, people do want to talk about this stuff. And not only that, but it actually is the connection that I saw between punk rock and mental health was there, because like that was an idea that I had, but I didn't really know that it was only for myself. Right. So a lot of the guests would say, punk rock saved my life, which is one of the slogans of the book. And when I heard that for the first time from somebody else, it just was so emotional because that's what I had always thought. And it's actually the very first guest that I had on the show, Bianca from a band called Amygdala, who are actually from Texas. And she said that out of the blue. And I was like, whoa, like that's heavy. And it's come up so many times over the last 4 years that I've been doing it.
For more episodes of Scream Therapy, go to screamtherapyhq.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. Big news, the Scream Therapy book is available now. Scream Therapy, A Punk Journey Through Mental Health, tells my story and the stories of others who use punk as a catalyst for mental health. Like this podcast, it links the community-minded punk scene with the mental wellness of the punks who belong to it. To order the book, go to screamtherapyhq.com. For merch, check out Scream Therapy on TeePublic. Okay, enough promoting, it's time for some thanking. Thank you for listening to Scream Therapy. Doing this podcast and talking to folks about punk rock and mental health has been a crucial part of my own mental stability, and it means so much to me that you're out there listening. Scream Therapy is created in the Cathet region of coastal British Columbia, Canada, on the traditional territory of the Tla'amin Nation. Contact me at screamtherapyhq.com or email me at screamtherapypodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Let's talk about punk rock and mental health. Until next time, take care and be well.